There is no telling what Moe Norman would have won. I think he would have won the U.S. Open. I think he would have won all the tournaments around the world. I mean, he is that good, and he's still that good.
He looked up at the camera one day and said those words, simply, quietly, and without a single drop of self-pity. I never forgave him. Not angry, not dramatic, just honest. And when a man like Moe Norman says something like that, you stop what you are doing and you listen. Because Moe Norman was not a bitter person. He was not a man who complained easily or pointed fingers without cause. He was a man who spent every waking hour of his life chasing something beautiful. He chased the perfect strike, the clean, pure, undeniable moment when a golf club meets a ball exactly right and sends it sailing into the sky with a sound like a whisper and a flight like a dream. That was Moe Norman. That was who he was at his core. A man in love with a golf ball and everything it could do. He was not just good at golf. He was not just talented or skilled or consistent. He was something else entirely. He was possibly the greatest ball striker who has ever lived on this earth. Tiger Woods said so. Vijay Singh called him a gift from God. And those are not small voices in the game of golf. Those are the biggest names the sport has ever produced. So take a moment to sit with that. The greatest ball striker who ever lived. A misunderstood genius. A man whose swing was so pure and so effective that the legends of the sport studied it like a textbook. If this story moves you the way it moves so many golf fans, use the hype feature and give this video some hype. It helps more people find out who Moe Norman really was. Now here is what makes this story so much harder to sit with. The very same people who should have celebrated him, who should have protected him and opened doors for him and stood beside him, did the opposite. They mocked him, they blocked him, they broke him down, piece by piece, until the greatest talent in the sport was sleeping in his car and hiding in sand traps just to avoid their cruelty. And Moe Norman never forgot that. He named 5 men, 5 golfers he said he would never forgive. And what he described, when you put it all together, is not just a series of bad moments. It is something much larger and much darker. It is the story of how a sport built an entire system designed to keep one man out. Golf has always told a beautiful story about itself. It says that the scorecard does not lie. It says that the fairway is open to anyone who can play. It says that skill is the only currency that matters on the golf course. That was the promise of the game. That was the ideal that drew so many people to it. But Moe Norman's life tells a very different story. In the 1950s and 60s, the PGA Tour was changing fast. It was moving away from its rough, barnstorming roots and transforming into something polished and corporate and country club clean. The ideal professional golfer of that era was not just expected to be good at golf. He was expected to look a certain way, talk a certain way, dress a certain way, and move through the world with the easy confidence of a man who belonged in a room full of wealthy strangers. Moe Norman could not do any of those things. Not because he lacked intelligence or heart or dignity, but because his brain worked differently from the brains of the men making the rules. He was a working-class kid from Ontario, Canada. He lived on the autism spectrum at a time when the world had no framework for understanding what that meant. He repeated phrases. He spoke fast, sometimes too fast for people to follow. He wore clothes that did not match the glossy image the tour was trying to project. And he had an obsessive, relentless, consuming love for striking a golf ball that made him seem strange to men who were more interested in the cocktail party after the round than the driving range before it. The fairway was supposed to be open, but there was a wall around the clubhouse, and the men who built that wall decided very early on that Moe Norman was not welcome inside. Now, we are going to walk through the 5 men Moe named, and we are going to do it in a particular order, because the betrayal that cut deepest did not come from an American legend or a tour icon. It came from home. It came from a fellow Canadian, and that is where we begin. Number 5. Al Balding. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes when the people who should be closest to you are the ones who turn away the hardest. When a stranger rejects you, it hurts. But when someone who shares your background, your country, your journey, who should understand where you came from and what you had to overcome just to get to the same stage, when that person rejects you in front of everyone and blames you for the very damage caused by your rejection, that is a wound that does not close easily. That is the wound Al Balding opened. Imagine being Moe Norman and knowing that the whole American golf establishment has decided you do not belong. Imagine carrying that weight every single day, showing up to practice ranges and tournaments, knowing that the most powerful men in the sport have quietly agreed to shut you out. Now imagine that in the middle of all that, you look over your shoulder, expecting to see at least one friendly face, one person who knows where you come from, one fellow Canadian who understands the journey you made just to get here. And instead, that person turns away from you, not just quietly, publicly, with words designed to make sure everyone knows he is nothing like you. That was Al Balding, and that is why what he did belongs in a category all its own. Balding was working hard to build a name for himself on the international golf stage. He wanted to be seen as polished and professional. He wanted the American elite to look at him and see a respectable, serious golfer. And in his mind, Moe Norman was a threat to that image, not because Moe had done anything wrong, but because Moe was eccentric and unconventional and did not fit the mold. Balding made a cold, calculated decision. He distanced himself from Norman completely. He did not do it quietly or with any kind of grace. He called Moe Norman a national embarrassment. He chose image over loyalty in the most deliberate and public way possible. But it got worse. When Canadian golfers began to lose their regular invitations to the Masters, Balding pointed the finger directly at Moe. He told anyone who would listen that Norman's behavior was the reason, that Moe's eccentricities had embarrassed the country and cost Canadian golf one of its most prestigious opportunities. That was not an honest assessment of what happened. That was scapegoating. The real reason Canadian golfers lost those spots had far more to do with the systemic, exclusionary practices of the Augusta National Committee than anything Moe Norman ever did on a practice range. But Balding took a complicated institutional reality and turned it into a simple, ugly story where Moe was the villain. Think about what that does to a person. Moe Norman had already been rejected by the American golf world for being different. He had already been laughed at, mocked, and blocked from opportunities he earned with his talent. And now, the one community where he should have had a home, the Canadian golf world, was being told by one of its own prominent voices that Moe Norman was the problem, that Moe Norman was an embarrassment, that Moe Norman had cost them something precious. It turned the victim into the villain. It took a man who had been systematically excluded and made him responsible for the consequences of that exclusion. And it did lasting damage to how Canadian golf understood its own history. Balding chose to be seen with the powerful and the polished. He chose to throw a countryman under the bus to protect his own standing. That is a failure of loyalty, so complete and so deliberate that it is hard to find words for it. Moe Norman found 3. He never forgave. Number 4, Doug Ford. If Al Balding's betrayal came from cold calculation, Doug Ford's cruelty was something rawer and more mean-spirited. Ford was a major champion, a fixture of the Augusta elite, a man who had earned his place at the top of the sport, and seemed to believe that earning that place gave him the right to decide who else deserved to be there. The year was 1956. Moe Norman had earned his way into the Masters at Augusta National. Let that land for a moment. Augusta National, the most sacred and storied ground in American golf. Moe Norman had gotten there on pure skill. No shortcuts, no connections, no social capital, just a golf swing so good that even the gatekeepers of the sport could not keep him out of the field. He arrived ready for the biggest week of his life. And the moment he walked through the gates, Doug Ford and other established professionals began a campaign of mockery that was calculated and relentless. They whispered about his clothing. They laughed at his appearance. They made it clear, through their words and their looks and their body language, that a working-class Canadian kid who did not dress right and did not talk right had no business being in their sacred space. His clothes were stained and disheveled. To them, that was disqualifying. To them, that was cause for ridicule. To them, appearance was not just a preference, it was a weapon. For a man who already carried deep social anxiety, who already felt like an outsider in almost every social space he entered, this was not just unpleasant, it was devastating. Moe Norman had been told his whole life, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that he did not belong. And here were the gods of professional golf confirming it, right there at Augusta, right there at the place that was supposed to be the ultimate validation of his talent. So Moe did what people do when they are in pain and have nowhere safe to go. He retreated. He stopped going to the clubhouse. He avoided the shared spaces where the ridicule lived. He slept in his car. He slept in sand traps on the golf course itself. A man who had earned the right to walk those fairways as a competitor was sleeping in a bunker to avoid the cruelty of the men who were supposed to be his peers. And then, on top of everything Ford had already done, on top of everything the social atmosphere at Augusta had already done to him, something else happened that finished the job. We will get to that in a moment. But understand that by the time Moe Norman finally walked away from that tournament without finishing, it was not because his golf had failed. His golf never failed. He left because the human beings around him had created an environment so hostile, so cruel, and so relentlessly demeaning that his spirit simply could not hold up under the weight of it. Ford and his group succeeded in making one of the greatest golfers in the world feel safer sleeping in a sand trap than standing in their presence. There is no defending that. There is no explaining it away or minimizing it. That is cruelty, dressed up in khaki trousers and a country club blazer. And cruelty of that kind, aimed at a man who was already fighting just to exist comfortably in a social world that was not built for him, deserves to be called exactly what it is. Not hazing, not competitive edge, not the rough edges of a tough sport. Targeted, deliberate human cruelty. The kind that leaves marks that do not show on the outside. Number 3. Ken Venturi. Ken Venturi won the United States Open. He became one of the most respected voices in golf broadcasting for decades. He was intelligent, articulate, and influential. And he used every bit of that intelligence and influence to make sure the world saw Moe Norman as a problem rather than a genius. What Venturi did was different from what Ford did. Ford mocked Moe to his face. That was cruel, but it was also simple. What Venturi did was more sophisticated and ultimately more damaging. He built a narrative. He gave the golf world a framework for dismissing Moe Norman, and he did it in the public eye, in a way that gave every player, every official, and every fan permission to turn their backs and call it reasonable. When people asked Venturi why a player of Moe Norman's obvious talent was not a permanent fixture on the American tour, Venturi did not say Moe could not hit the ball. Nobody could say that. The evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, Venturi called Moe's behavior unsettling. He pointed to Moe's hygiene. He pointed to his speech patterns. He pointed to his social awkwardness. And he used those things to argue that Moe simply did not belong in the environment of professional golf. Pause on that word, unsettling. In the context of a sport that called itself a gentleman's game, that word was not just an observation. It was a verdict, and it came from a man whose opinion carried enormous weight. By calling Moe Norman unsettling, Venturi was taking real neurodivergent traits, the echolalia, the fast speech, the sensory sensitivities, the social difficulties that came from being autistic in a world that did not understand autism, and he was framing them not as things that deserved understanding, but as things that deserved exclusion. He was not saying Moe needed help or support or accommodation. He was saying Moe was the problem. He was saying the comfortable feelings of the established players mattered more than the extraordinary talent of a man who processed the world differently. He transformed a failure of empathy by the golf establishment into a moral position. He made discrimination sound like common sense. And that narrative spread. It became the approved story. It became the reason people gave each other when they wanted to explain why Moe was not out there competing against the best golfers in the world every week. Not that he had been blocked, or shunned, or sabotaged, but that he was simply too unsettling to be around, too rough around the edges, too much of a disruption to the polite, stately order of the tour. The cruelty of that framing is hard to fully absorb if you think about it honestly. Here was a man with a neurological difference that he did not choose and could not simply decide to switch off. Here was a man doing the best he could with the brain he had been given, navigating a social world that was never designed for people like him, showing up every single day to a sport that he loved with everything he had. And the most respected commentating voice in golf was telling the world that the problem was not how the sport treated Moe Norman. The problem was Moe Norman himself. It shifted the burden entirely. It said the man who was being hurt had to change in order to deserve protection. And because that voice carried such weight, most people listening believed it without question. This is what makes Venturi's role so particularly harmful. He gave intellectual and moral cover to something that was neither intellectual nor moral. He dressed up discrimination in respectable language and sent it out into the world where it did its damage for decades. Moe Norman could not play golf without being extraordinary, but he could not escape the story Venturi helped write about him either. Number 2, Jack Nicklaus. Jack Nicklaus is widely considered one of the greatest golfers who ever played the game. 18 major championships, a career that defined an era, a man whose name became synonymous with greatness, with excellence, with the very highest standards the sport could offer. He was also, by his own later admission, part of a coordinated effort to keep Moe Norman out. That is not speculation. That is not a hostile interpretation of ambiguous events. Nicklaus himself confirmed it. He acknowledged that the exclusion Moe Norman faced was not random. It was not a series of coincidences or misunderstandings. It was a collective action. The top legends of the era, the men who sat at the very peak of the sport's social and professional pyramid, made a decision together. They decided that Moe Norman did not belong. And they enforced that decision through the tools available to them: tournament invitations, sponsor relationships, social capital, and the silent weight of institutional consensus. The reasons Nicklaus gave for this collective decision are worth examining carefully. He pointed to Norman's nomadic lifestyle, his lack of hygiene, his eccentric behavior, not his scores, not his driving accuracy, not his iron play, not any single thing that actually had to do with hitting a golf ball. The criteria for exclusion were entirely social. They were about whether Moe Norman fit the image the tour wanted to project. And the answer, among the men who had the power to make that call, was a clear and unanimous no. Think about what that actually meant in practical terms. In professional golf, your career is not just built on what you do on the course. It is built on what happens off it. Invitations to major events do not come automatically. They are extended based on relationships, reputation, and standing within the community. Sponsor access depends on being seen as someone the corporate world wants to associate with. Platform, visibility, and financial opportunity all flow through social channels that require being accepted by the people who control those channels. And the people who controlled those channels had collectively decided to shut Moe Norman out. So while Moe was out on the practice range, hitting balls with the kind of precision that left observers genuinely speechless, the men who could have opened the doors that his talent deserved were holding those doors closed. They were not doing it because Moe could not play. They were doing it because he made them uncomfortable, because he did not look right, or act right, or live right by their standards, because his otherness threatened the carefully maintained image of a sport that had decided it was more important to be respectable than to be honest about greatness. Nicklaus eventually admitted this. He offered praise for Norman's swing late in Norman's life. Some people have held that up as a kind of redemption, but consider what it actually means. During the years when Moe Norman should have been competing against the best players in the world every week, when he should have been building a career and a legacy and a financial foundation from his extraordinary gifts, he was being actively blocked. And the man who later admitted that shunning was real and institutional stayed silent about it while it was happening. Silence in that context is not neutrality. Silence is participation. Silence is agreement. Silence is choosing the comfort of the powerful over the defense of the right. The years that silence covered were not small years. They were the years a golfer builds everything on. They were the years when rivals were accumulating major titles and sponsor deals and the kind of name recognition that follows a player for the rest of his life. While all of that was happening for the men who fit the mold, Moe Norman was being quietly and methodically shut out of the rooms where those opportunities were decided. That is not a footnote. That is the main story. Nicklaus represents the failure of leadership. He was the kind of figure who could have spoken up, who could have used his standing and his influence to say that the way the sport was treating Moe Norman was wrong. He did not. And because he did not, the shunning continued and the damage compounded, year after year after year. Number 1, Sam Snead. We have arrived at the betrayal that sits at the center of Moe Norman's story, the one that haunts every account of his life, the one that serves as the clearest, most visceral symbol of everything the golf establishment did to him. Sam Snead, Augusta National, 1956. And a set of hands that look like hamburger by morning. To understand what happened, you first have to understand what Sam Snead meant to Moe Norman. Snead was not just a famous golfer. He was an idol. He was one of the gods. His swing was considered the most beautiful and fluid in the history of the game. To Moe, Snead was proof of what golf could be at its very highest level. He was someone Moe looked up to with the kind of reverence that is almost impossible to overstate. So when Snead walked up to him on the practice range at Augusta, Moe did not see a rival or a peer. He saw a deity descending from the mountaintop to speak to him. What Snead said was this: "Your long iron technique is too steep. You should sweep them like a fairway would." Now, for most golfers, a tip from a fellow pro, even a famous one, is just that, a tip. You try it, you see if it feels right, and if it does not, you set it aside and go back to what works for you. That is what a neurotypical player with a healthy sense of his own game would do. But Moe was not processing that advice the way most players would. His brain, with its literal interpretation and its obsessive drive for perfectionism and its deep need to please the people he admired, received that tip not as a suggestion, but as a command. Snead had spoken. The god had given instructions, and Moe Norman was going to follow those instructions until he got it right. He stayed on the range until well after dark. He hit ball after ball after ball, hundreds of repetitions, chasing the sweeping motion Snead had described, trying to rebuild something fundamental about his technique on the eve of one of the most important tournaments of his life. Historical accounts say he hit over 800 balls that day. 800 in one session on a practice range in the dark. By the next morning, his hands were destroyed. The skin on his palms and fingers had been shredded. Blood and deep blisters covered both hands to the point where gripping a golf club was simply not possible. The man who had earned his way into the Masters on pure skill could not pick up a club. He had to withdraw from the tournament. Now, the historical record leaves room for debate about what Snead intended. Some accounts suggest the advice may have been given carelessly, without any real thought for how Moe would receive it or act on it. Other accounts suggest something more deliberate, a calculated move by an established player to neutralize a rising talent who struck the ball better than almost anyone. What is not in debate is the result. The most gifted ball striker in the field was removed from the competition, not by a missed putt or a triple bogey, but by advice given on a practice range by a man he trusted completely. And the cost was not just the Masters that year. The cost was something much deeper. Moe Norman had arrived at Augusta already battered by the mockery of Doug Ford and the hostile atmosphere of the clubhouse culture. He was already running on fumes, emotionally. He was already sleeping in his car and in sand traps to avoid the people who sneered at his clothing and laughed at his presence. And then the one person he looked up to, the idol, the god, the man whose approval meant more to him than almost anyone else's, had given him advice that physically destroyed him. Moe Norman later talked about feeling like a servant to the gods of the tour. That feeling started here, that moment on the range, with Snead standing over him uninvited and offering advice he had not asked for, was the moment the power dynamics of professional golf revealed themselves most nakedly. Snead did not approach Moe as an equal. He approached him as someone with authority over a lesser figure. And whether by design or by careless disregard for the human being in front of him, that authority was exercised in a way that ended Moe Norman's chance at Augusta and shattered something inside him that never fully healed. There is a reason this is the story people most often tell about Moe Norman. There is a reason those hamburger hands have become the symbol of everything the sport did to him, because it captures in a single image the full weight of what it meant to be Moe Norman in that world. Extraordinary talent, complete devotion to the craft, and total vulnerability to the cruelty or carelessness of the men who held power over him. Now step back and look at all 5 of these men together. Look at what they represent when you lay their actions side by side. You have Balding, who failed in loyalty, choosing image over his own countrymen and then blaming that countryman for consequences he did not cause. You have Ford, who failed in empathy, using a man's appearance and social anxiety as weapons to drive him out of spaces he had rightfully earned. You have Venturi, who failed in discourse, using his platform and his language to turn neurodivergent traits into moral failings and give everyone else permission to do the same. You have Nicklaus, who failed in leadership, standing silently inside a collective decision to shut out a misunderstood genius because he did not fit a social mold. And you have Snead, who failed in mentorship, approaching a vulnerable, idol-worshipping young man and giving him advice that destroyed his hands on the eve of the most important tournament of his life. What is striking when you look at all 5 failures together is how perfectly they interlocked. None of them would have been enough on its own to completely derail a career of Moe Norman's caliber. A single cruel peer could be avoided. A single bad tip could be overcome. A single institutional voice spreading a damaging narrative could be countered. But all 5, working together, reinforcing each other, each one making the others more powerful, created something that a person could not simply fight their way out of. Each failure closed off a different exit. Balding closed the national door. Ford closed the social door. Venturi closed the narrative door. Nicklaus closed the institutional door. And Snead closed the physical door at the moment it mattered most. There was nowhere left to go. Together, they formed something that deserves a name. The research that informed this story calls it the architecture of exclusion, a deliberate and structured system of social and professional barriers that work together to ensure Moe Norman stayed on the outside. It was not chaos. It was not a series of random, unfortunate events. It was a machine, and the machine had moving parts. Mockery to create social anxiety, Institutional shunning to cut off access and invitations. Narrative control to make the exclusion seem reasonable. Sabotage to physically remove him from the moments that mattered. And scapegoating to make him responsible for the damage. The machine was built to protect something. On the surface, it was protecting the image of the tour. The polished, country club, clean-cut image that the sport was trying to sell to sponsors and television audiences. But underneath that, the machine was also protecting something else. It was protecting the technical and economic order of the sport. Because here is a truth that the establishment could not afford to face openly. Moe Norman's swing worked better than theirs. His single plane method, the wide stance and the high hands and the minimal wrist cock, and the club grounded 12 inches back, all the things they called ugly and primitive and weird, produced accuracy so extreme that it created pressure and frustration for rivals. His fast, efficient, echolalic pace disrupted the stately rhythm they had built around the game. And if Moe Norman was right, if his simple approach to striking a golf ball was more effective than the complex, high-maintenance techniques the establishment had built careers and teaching empires around, then something uncomfortable had to be true. The mystique was false. The complexity was unnecessary. The expensive lessons and the elaborate mechanics were not actually what made great golf. A working-class Canadian kid, hitting balls alone on a range until dark, had figured out a better way. And that was something the sport simply could not afford to acknowledge. So they excluded him instead. And in doing so, they did not just harm Moe Norman, they harmed the sport. They harmed every golfer who could have learned from watching him compete at the highest level. They harmed the game's credibility as a meritocracy. They sent a message to every unconventional talent who came after him that brilliance was not enough if you did not also fit the mold. The consequences ran deep. The shunning Nicklaus admitted to was a form of institutional gatekeeping that kept the sport culturally uniform. The scapegoating Balding engaged in shaped how an entire country understood its own golfing history. The damage compounded over years and decades, not just for Moe, but for every player who learned from his example that the wall around the clubhouse was real. And then, something strange happened. The sport that had excluded him decided, late in his life, to celebrate him. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, golf began to rediscover Moe Norman. Tiger Woods, the most dominant player of that era, admitted that he had studied Norman's swing as a teenager and found something in it that most players had missed. Vijay Singh, one of the finest ball strikers of his generation, called Norman a gift from God. Suddenly, the swing that had been mocked as ugly and primitive was being analyzed and celebrated. Suddenly, the man who had been called unsettling and an embarrassment was being held up as a visionary. And here is the part that matters. The very same world that had used Snead to destroy his hands, and Ford to drive him out of the clubhouse, and Venturi to make his exclusion sound reasonable, and Nicklaus to enforce the institutional boycott, and Balding to blame him for the damage that exclusion caused. That same world was now putting Norman's name on training aids and instructional videos and marketing materials. The genius they had shunned was now a brand. The man they had broken was now a selling point. That is not redemption. That is not even close to redemption. Real redemption would have looked like Tiger Woods saying, in his prime, that the sport owed Moe Norman an apology, and that the men who had excluded him had been wrong. Real redemption would have looked like the institutions that had blocked him, opening their doors and saying that what they had done was a failure of everything the game claimed to stand for. What actually happened was that the golf world waited until Moe Norman could no longer compete, until his prime years were gone and the damage was done, and then it celebrated him safely, from a comfortable distance, in a way that cost no one anything. It was a posthumous apology that could not give back a single tournament, a single invitation, a single year of competition that had been stolen. It was recognition that came too late to matter in the ways that mattered most. But here is what could not be taken away: the truth, the record, the evidence that stands regardless of what the establishment said or did or failed to do. Moe Norman hit a golf ball better than almost any human being who ever lived. That is documented. That is witnessed. That is confirmed by the greatest players of multiple generations. His swing, the one they called ugly and primitive and wrong, became the subject of serious technical study by players who went on to dominate the sport. His methods, the ones they dismissed and ridiculed, turned out to be closer to the ideal than the methods they had built their empires on. And his refusal to forgive, the 5 names he carried without letting go, was not bitterness. It was something more honest than that. It was a recognition of what had been done. It was a refusal to pretend that cruelty was just misunderstanding, or that systemic exclusion was just a series of bad luck. It was Moe Norman saying, clearly and without drama, that what those men did was wrong, and that he knew it was wrong, and that he was not going to pretend otherwise just to make the story more comfortable for everyone else. He deserved better from the sport he loved. He deserved better from the men who had the power to give him a fair chance and chose not to. He deserved to compete on the stage his talent had earned. He deserved to be understood rather than mocked. He deserved a fellow countryman who stood beside him instead of stepping over him on the way up the ladder. None of that happened during the years when it could have mattered most. But Moe Norman kept hitting golf balls anyway. He kept showing up at ranges and practicing until dark, and sending balls into the sky with that strange, perfect, unmistakable flight that made people stop and stare. He kept loving the thing he had always loved. And in the end, the truth of his swing outlasted everything that had been done to hide it. The architecture of exclusion eventually crumbled, and what was left standing underneath it, unchanged and undeniable, was the genius they had tried so hard to erase. That is Moe Norman's legacy, not the tournaments he did not get to play, not the years he spent on the outside, but the truth of what he could do with a golf club in his hands. A truth so powerful and so pure that it survived everything 5 men and an entire establishment threw at it. He did not need their validation to be great. He was great without it. He would always have been great without it, with or without their approval. The only difference their cruelty made was in how many people got to witness that greatness while it was happening at its peak. And for that, the sport of golf owes a debt it can never fully repay. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment down below and tell us what you think golf owes Moe Norman. If you are new here, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive. And if you know someone who loves the game and has never heard this story, share it with them. Because the more people who know the truth about Moe Norman, the harder it becomes to bury it again.